I'd like to welcome you tonight on behalf of the George and Irina Schaeffer Center for the Study of Genocide, Human Rights and Conflict Prevention. And tonight I have the pleasure of welcoming a very good friend of mine, Bill Hirst, to lecture to us this evening. Bill is should I say, cognitive psychologist. He's a psychologist at the New School for Social Research, where he is the Malcolm B. Smith Chair and Professor of Psychology. I've known Bill for quite a long time, and actually something that's interesting is that we actually taught together and taught together a linked class here at AUP with the New School for Social Research a couple of times on social memory. It was, well, yeah. It was exciting and interesting. So I'm really pleased to have Bill here tonight. He's got a long list of publications in psychology on the topic of memory and on a number of different topics in memory, including memory of very traumatic events. And tonight, Bill's lecture is Intergenerational Memories of Important Events, the Intersection of the Personal and the Historical. Please, let's welcome Bill.
So I'd like to thank AUP and Brian for having me here tonight. It's always a pleasure to be back in Paris. How can it not be a pleasure to be back in Paris? And so I should also confess that this is the first time I've ever given this talk, so you are my guinea pigs. And as you can see, it's on the intergenerational memories of important events, the intersection of the personal and the historical. Now, I don't probably need to tell this crowd, but the way we remember the past shapes both our identity and our actions. And this is true whether you're considering personal memories or collective memories. And hence, the study of collective memory becomes a very important topic because it bears on identity and action. And the formation of collective memories, the initial study of it was done by a guy named Maurice Halbwachs, who was a student of Durkheim's. He offered a perspective on collective memory, which is not necessarily the same perspective that I'm sharing. And for me, I'm going to treat collective memories here as individual memories shared across communities that bear on the community's collective identity. It's important to emphasize that collective memories are not simply shared memories. They're memories that must bear on a collective memory. So all Spaniards probably know what the value of pi is, 3.14, but you wouldn't call that a Spanish collective memory because it doesn't bear on what it means to be a Spaniard. On the other hand, the Madrid bombing does bear, they all probably know about that, and it also bears on their sense of being a Spaniard. Now, the study of collective memory has really flourished since Halbwachs. Some people have actually referred to it as a memory boom. There are literally thousands of papers, and some people have kvetched that it's really an industry, not a scholarly pursuit at this point. But psychologists' contribution to this rather large endeavor has been minimal. If you do a psych info search, you can find thousands of articles in collective memory and social history, journals and the like. Only a few hundred, and Maria, Jens, and Brian would be one of those hundreds, or several of those hundreds. So they have made a contribution, but not many other psychologists have done so. More so nowadays than before, but still it's a little impoverished as a field, at least from a psychological approach. Now, there are different ways of approaching collective memory from a psychological perspective. I want to differentiate between what I call top-down perspectives and bottom-up perspectives. Top-down perspectives have often involved what you people often refer to the social representation of history. Serge Moscovitch, as most of you know, was the sort of founder of this approach to social representation, and there are individuals that have applied social representation theory to the study of history. There's also the bottom-up approach. The bottom-up approach essentially says, now, in the top-down approach, what you do is you essentially first find out what people know about history. So here you're talking about real historical events. You're talking about the way in which people represent the past, historical past. And then you sort of go down a little bit and try to understand the psychological processes of why you might remember this aspect versus that aspect. And I should probably emphasize here is there's a distinction between memory for history versus history, the professional study of history. You can, if you're a professional historian, you have to sort of keep to the facts. You can argue about whether something is a fact or not, but once it's proved that it's not a fact and it's a myth, then you cannot incorporate it into your history. People, when you talk about memory, you're under no such constraints. But the notion is you start with something that people actually represent about the actual past, historical past, and then you go down to look at the psychological processes. The bottom up starts with basic psychological processes, and it may start at a dyadic exchange in which one person exchanges something with another, and you look at the way one person influences the memory of the other. Here, it doesn't really matter what it is that the memory is involved. It's just could be anything. It doesn't have to be historical. It doesn't have to be something that actually happened. It's just one person, two people, for instance, studying something, then one person talking to the other person and somehow influencing them. And the notion is that memory is malleable, so you're going to have this exchange of this conversational exchange will reshape the memories, presumably, of both of the individuals. Then, since it's bottom up, you're going to go from this bottom, and you want to go up to a larger network, and where you essentially now, since you originally had a dyad here, you can then look at how one person affects the next person, and that person affects the next person in the network, and then you can see both in terms of the psychological principles governing the dyadic exchange and the network structure, whether the network in the end converges on a shared representation of the past. And the notion is that something happens at a very local level, at the dyadic level, will be forceful enough, at least for some network structures, to shape the larger network in terms of what the network remembers, and whether it converges on a shared representation. This approach, it doesn't really, as I said, it doesn't really matter what the memory is. It can be anything whatsoever, but it really is trying to understand how a network of connected individuals can converge on a shared representation. I'm going to, most of the top-down approach focuses on relates to identity issues. The fact that you remember this aspect of history and not that aspect of history says something about what it means to be a Frenchman or an American or whatever. Whereas the more networky bottom-up approach tends to focus more on why things become shared. So one is more of an identity project, the other is more of a why things become shared project. Now, I'm going to really be focusing here, and in terms of my own personal research, I've done stuff both on the bottom up, mostly on the bottom up, but also some on the top down, and the top down is a more recent effort, and one of the more recent efforts have been my interest in intergenerational memories. And it really, in intergenerational memories, in some way has the possibility of combining both of these projects. In some way, you're dealing with a network. Here, you're not dealing with a network where everybody sort of exists at one moment and one person talks to the next person and talks to the next person. You're talking about intergenerational memory, where one generation talks to the next generation, which then talks to the next generation. And it will deal with not arbitrary memories, but pre-existing memories. And that is, I will be interested in how one generation affects the way the next generation understands the historical past. And then whether that continues to affect yet the second generation. So you can ask questions like, how do different generations remember the same event? What is one generation inclined to convey to another generation? How many generations does a memory propagate? And what propagates? These are some of the questions that you could ask about the exchange of, and now we're talking about historical information. So two distinctions are going to drive most of my discussion. The first is a distinction between lived and distant collective memories. Collective memories can be talked about that occurs during one's lifetime. So for instance, and I'm going to call these lived collective memories. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to personally experience them. In some way, I didn't personally experience the attack on 9/11. I wasn't down at ground zero when it occurred, but I learned about it by watching television, by hearing people talk about it. It's not a direct experience, it's an indirect experience, but it's still a lived experience because I feel it occurred in my lifetime. But it's not enough for the event to occur in your lifetime. It must also be incorporated into the community's collective memory. 9/11 clearly is incorporated into the American collective memory. But I suspect for most Americans, they have no idea who Aldo Moro is and why he was assassinated, if even he was assassinated. It's not, but it occurred at least during my lifetime, but it doesn't really bear on my collective memory of almost anything. Now I want to contrast that with distant collective memories. Many collective memories of historical collective memories the events that they refer to occurred way before you were ever born. I'm going to call them distant collective memories. So the memories of the French Revolution or the memories of the American Civil War would be examples of distant collective memories. Now, some people may actually question whether or not these are actually memories. But I think of them as like semantic memories. If you know the distinction between episodic and semantic memories, yes, they're not part of your personal life. Yes, you did not experience them, but nevertheless, you have somehow or other represented them in a way that allows you, even though the information is not in front of you at that time, to bring that up in a conversation or when queried in some way, shape, or form. So it's a memory of some form, and psychologists would call it a semantic memory. Now, the other distinction I want to make is between cultural and communicative memory, and this is associated with a guy named Ostman. And cultural memories are memories that have been captured by cultural artifacts, the books, the movies, the books about, let's say, 9/11 or the French Revolution, the movies, the museums, the commemorations, and so on. So this afternoon I went to the Shoah Museum in the Marais, and there was a lot of discussion about memory and all the little placards, that the need to establish memory and how the French had forgotten and that they were reviving this amnesia. I'm not so sure. But in any case, there was a lot of discussion about that. And that building there and the writing inside of it is a cultural artifact that's meant to preserve memories. This is in contrast to communicative memories. Communicative memories are memories which are transmitted interpersonally. When you learn about who your mother dated when she was like your age, that's a communicative memory, because it's a memory that has been presumably it's not going to get in any book, it's not going to be put in any cultural artifact. It will just rest through that communicative exchange. And Ostman says that in some way these represent more ordinary memories. As the example that I gave just shows, communicative memories have a fairly short temporal horizon. Ostman says 2 or 3 generations, about 100 years. You may know about who your mother dated, but grandmother not so much, and you probably almost know nothing about your great-great-great-grandmother, if you know anything at all. This is in contrast to cultural memories, that because they're materially preserved, they can, essentially that memory can linger for multiple generations. And Ostman claims that if you're interested in collective identity of, for instance, a nation, a national identity, that you have to somehow move things from communicative memory to cultural memories in order for them to preserve over multiple generations. Now, the community I'm going to talk about, which should be clear at this point given all my examples, is the nation. And I'll be interested in part how different generations remember national history. Probably the earliest studies, empirical studies of this are Schumann and Scott's work. They asked people of different ages essentially to list 1 or 2 important events in the last 50 years. And what they found was something akin to what you see in autobiographical memory, which is a reminiscence bump, that people seem to like or prefer or bring to mind or find readily accessible those memories which are associated with the period between 18 and 35. Lots of literature about what the actual boundaries of this is, doesn't matter, really, that young adult age. And you see here those that are younger tend to mention the Vietnam War. Those which are older tend to mention much more frequently World War II. And it's a very robust effect. I remember teaching many years ago this to a class and talking about, they were reading Schumann and Scott, and then they, as a, what professors do is they say, well, why don't you try it, and why don't you list the 2 most important events? And I was shocked to see so many people mention the Berlin Wall. It had never occurred to me to write down the Berlin Wall. It just had never occurred to me, because it happened way past my little reminiscence bump for these memories. When I felt really embarrassed, but I'm confessing it right now, so I couldn't have been that embarrassed. But in any case, what it suggests is that there may be generational difference, but that people have access to some historical lived collective memories that are preferential to a certain time period in their lives. And I think this is fairly well established now in a large number of studies. And Amy Corning and Howard Schumann have a great book that goes through all of this literature. But I want to look at how generational differences might exist that may transcend this sort of age boundary. Do different generations remember different things in different ways as a generation, not just in terms of that particular time period? And a former student of mine, Felipe Mueller, along with a student of his, began to look at this, looking at the asking Argentinians to remember the 1976 coup d'etat. Just to refresh your memory about this, if you have a memory about it, it was the right-wing military coup overthrew Isabel Perón in March 24, 1976. A dirty war then ensued in which approximately 30,000 people were killed, mostly young people who resisted, and many of them simply disappeared. The military remained in power to 1983. It probably lost power because the junta had a fight with Britain over the Falkland Islands, and they lost, showing their weakness. There was economic recession, terrible economic recession, and eventually Raúl Alfines was elected democratically. He then began to prosecute the leaders of the junta for crimes against humanity, and that they were tried and convicted in 1985. So that's a brief history. So what we did was we got folks that were above 47 years of age and folks who were below 30 years of age, all Argentinians. And so some people had lived memories, some people had distant memories. And we also made sure that we had some people in both groups that were on the left, and some people in both groups were ideologically affiliated with the right. We started with a simple free recall question, just asking them to remember anything they could about the coup d'etat on March 24th. And then we had a series of free recall questions in which we asked them specific question like what happened to Isabel Perón. We asked them, which would be a fact question. We asked about causes, what caused the coup, and consequences. What were the social, political, and economic consequences of the coup? We then coded the free recall, and I shouldn't really say we. I didn't do really any of this. They did all it. I just said very good, very good. But I'll continue with the royal we. We coded them into non-narrative and narrative units. Narrative units were either personal, so you say, oh, when the coup happened, I was studying at the moment the military went in the Casa Rosada, which is the main parliamentary house. Non-personal narratives, the military pushed people alive out of planes. This is going to come up after, again, so I might as well explain it. To be efficient, there's a river that essentially goes, that is on the border of Argentina and Uruguay, not far from Buenos Aires. And basically they would take the people that they had captured, imprisoned, and they would put them in the planes, they would fly them over, then they would push them off alive. That way they managed to kill them and dispose of the body all in one fell swoop. It was very efficient. And it's really a memory that lingers for not surprising reasons. There were contextualizing statements, some of which involve consequences, some of which involve causes, and we also coded for effective evaluative remarks, whether they were positive or negative. Now, if you look at the free recall, those with lived memories recalled more personal narrative tellings than those with distant memories. They told it not in terms of how you would read about it in a textbook, they talked about it in terms of their personal experience. And those with distant memories, those people that had not lived with him, were less inclined to do so. Now, if we separate those people with lived memories into those who were very young, between, let's say, 10 and 16, and those who were older, we can see difference in terms of causes. Presumably, the younger people really weren't paying much attention to it one way or the other. And people that were older and lived through it tend to talk about causes more than people who have distant memories. Even though, I was somewhat surprised by that, because you think of history textbooks as supplying a narrative. And what narratives do is have a lot of causal connectors in it. But it was people that lived through it that had these causal connections, and not the people that had acquired it through more formal means, if you like. And this is an example of one of the sort of causal connections that one of the older lived through individuals said. The so-called national reorganization process began in coordination with other dictatorships that for some years were already governing other South American countries, all of them articulated in what was called Operation Candor, with the intelligence service of the United States, because these countries had strong interests in the maintenance of military governments which were functional to the general battle against the advance of Soviet communism. Just as an aside, absolutely irrelevant to this, but Kissinger told the junta as the United States became aware of the brutality of the junta, not to worry, we would be behind them. We were not good. Concerning facts, they, by and large, everybody, whether they lived through it or they were distant, they supplied generally the same facts. However, those who had lived memories but there were differences, and they tended to be an intersection of ideology and this type of memory. So those with lived memories on the left tended to recall more than any other that students were affected by the coup. Because even if you weren't a student at the time, you probably had kids who were students at the time. So that it really stuck out in some way, shape, or form, in a way that if you merely read about it, it didn't stick out as much. Also, those with distant memories on the left had a greater tendency to remember that babies were robbed. This is another thing I need to explain. One of the things because they were good Catholics, the Argentinians, I'm being a little cynical, I think, here, because they were good Catholics, if one of the women that they imprisoned was pregnant, they did not kill her immediately. They waited until the baby was born, and then they killed her, because you can't kill an innocent child. And so what the question is, what did you do with the babies? And they tended to then give the babies to military families that for some reason or other could not have children. And this had become a huge, when we did the survey, this was a huge issue in Argentina, because there was an organization involving grandmothers who wanted to find their grandchildren. And they had passed a law which basically said that if you thought this person was your grandchild, you could force that person to give DNA. And so you were essentially taking something from their body, which was their body, and forcing them to give you that information. And you can imagine it was a very complicated issue. It was a very big issue. And I could go on for like a long time about this. But anyway, the point is here that because it was the topic at the time, it emerged in the distant memories, but only among those on the left, because it was clearly something that the left would be sympathetic to and the right would be less sympathetic to. Interestingly, there were a number of don't know responses. And the don't know responses were more frequent for those on the right who did not live through the coup, who had distant memories. And I suspect that's why and they were specifically about the 2 times we saw it was the flight of death. That's where they pushed the people out of the planes, and the justification for the junta. And they would just say, I don't know. And I think one of the reasons is it's almost like a defensive move that they had to say, rather than say I know about the flights of death, which I think everybody knew about. They would say, I don't know. But it was only people for which it was a distant memory. If it was a lived memory, you tended to find a way to deal with this in a way that it was much harder for you to deal with once it was a distant memory. And those with lived memories were more likely to identify economic causes for the coup than those with distance memories, and which was a major problem why the coup occurred, was the economic issues. But this tendency was much greater on the left than the right, which is not surprising again. I should point out that by and large, the left recalled far more words and far more narrative units than the right. The left just talked and talked and talked, and the right did not talk and talk and talk. And the left also seemed to give more contextualizing statements. However, interestingly, the right recalled more effective evaluative remarks than the left, but they were positive. They felt the need to say, well, I remember that in general, people were happy with the coup d'etat. And a lot of people are happy when order is restored and things of that sort. So in summary, lived memories are more likely to be told in terms of personal recollections than simply the facts. Some indication that those who lived through the event saw the event in a more contextualized fashion. They remembered causes better, and even though cultural artifacts often supply a narrative. And what is recalled is moderated by ideology, not simply that the right tends to view the coup with rose-colored tinted glasses. When they did not live through the coup, they tended to respond, don't know, which is sort of a defensive gesture. And these defensive gestures were more likely to be seen in distant and lived memories. And also, it suggests that historically relevant personal, and what this really suggests, and that even though, what I want to emphasize is even though those with distant memories didn't have as many personal memories, they had some. And by personal memories, I mean memories concerning their parents. Not their own personal memories, but their parents' personal memories. And I think this is important because when you think about knowing something about your parents within a historical setting, it gives that event a certain resonance. So if you may know about the bombing of Dresden, but if you know that your mother hid out in in a basement during the bombing of Dresden, then suddenly the bombing of Dresden becomes an incredibly important event for you. In a way it wouldn't if you just read about it in a textbook and didn't have this personal connection. So I'm going to spend some time on just those things. That is personal memories that are historically relevant, that are embedded within a historical setting. These would be communicative memories, of course. Personal memories, you by and large, most people don't write down their personal memories about even historically relevant personal memories and then get them published and they're read widely and put away in the library and the like. They disappear fairly quickly. They're transmitted almost solely through interpersonal communication. We know that personal memories can be transmitted. Robin Fivish has done a lot of nice work, but on what are just his personal memories. That is, for instance, the example of, your mother, who your mother was, the first guy your mother dated, or something like that. People know these things, and in fact, Robin shows the more you know about your parents' life, the more likely there is this intergenerational or personal memories, the better you perform on various scales of well-being. But as I've been emphasizing, these are really just personal memories, not historically relevant personal memories. And so I want to spend some time on historically relevant personal memories. Now, there has been almost no work on this. I will talk about two studies that I think are relevant. One is at least empirical work. There's lots of work on intergenerational transmission of, for instance, concerning the Holocaust, but it tends to be more narrative, anecdotal, memoir-oriented, as opposed to sort of psychologists doing boring empirical studies. I'm talking to Brian. In this particular study by Schwab and Brown, they looked at two groups. They looked at a conflict group, and the conflict group had kids, children, who had parents that immigrated from conflict-torn country and were now living in Canada. And the non-conflict group were Canadians born and raised in Canada. And they were asked them to identify the 10 most important events in their parents' life. And they were only allowed to mention having a childbirth once. They couldn't mention it. Well, then they had Jane, then they had Harry, then they had Peter. They couldn't do that. They only could do it once. Then they had to date the events, and then they had to rate the events on how much they were discussed by the parents, the degree of psychological impact, the degree of material impact, and the degree it related to a historical, sorry for the misspelling, event. What you see is, first, that there's a clear reminiscence bump. That is, people tend to report events in their parents' life that occurred when their parents were young adults, presumably because they're the memories most accessible to the parents, and hence that's what they talk about. On the other hand, you see here in the black line, that's the conflict group. I can't go too far because the speaker, that's the conflict group. It lingered more, suggesting that when there was conflict, they included a lot more memories that sort of went beyond that sort of reminiscence bump. And the other thing to note, that there was also a clear reminiscence bump around the time of immigration that didn't necessarily correspond to young adulthood. And this has been noted by other people as well. In another study, they looked at children's memory of their Croatian parents' lives, and now their parents had either lived through the war in eastern Croatia, where the war was quite intense, or western Croatia, where it wasn't as intense, the so-called peaceful zone. And they now all live in Canada, a lovely Canada. So again, they followed a similar procedure: list 10 important events in a parent's life, date them, and then rate the memory on various scales. Again, you see that you get this reminiscent, you get a large number of memories that occur during the conflict period, and that is greater in Well, actually, it's just a large number. Uh, yeah, and also you see that there is a greater tendency to remember events that occurred around that were war related. If your parents were in the war, so you don't just you just didn't say, oh, my mom dated Peter, like he was a hunk or something. Rather, what you do is you say, she stood in a ration line, her house got bombed, things of that sort. And more so if you were in a war zone than if you were not in the war zone. And if war-related memories had much higher ratings in terms of the effect on the parents' and child's identity, how much they rehearsed it, the valence, how much material change had occurred in their parents' lives, how much psychological change had occurred in their lives and their parents' lives, how much it affected their parents' life decisions, how much the kids understood their parents, and how much it shaped the way they related to other people. So these two studies suggest that memories are transmitted, especially from the reminiscence bump period. That the transmitted memories have an impact, psychological impact, particularly in understanding the parent, and that transition and impact is greater if it is war related. Now, I wanted to follow up on this by looking at intergeneration transmission of now flashbulb memories of 9/11. Flashbulb memory is a quintessential personal memory, and although we're not really, you can't think of 9/11 as war-related in a way. It depends on what kind of vocabulary you decided to use afterwards, but it clearly was a traumatic event in a lot of people's lives. And you could say that flashbulb memories is a quintessential personal memory with historical resonance. And 9/11 is a quintessential flashbulb memory. So I wanted to know, what does the younger generation know about 9/11 and their parents' experience of 9/11? So we got through a Mechanical Turk parents who had kids of a certain age, and then essentially the children were between 9 and 19 years of age in spring 2016, where they were at least 4 years old at the time of 9/11. We didn't want to interview people lower than 4 years old because they figured they wouldn't have any idea at all that anything was happening. And also in 2016, it was much harder to find those people. We asked about the kids' knowledge of the parents' flashbulb memories, the parents' predictions about what their children know about their parents' flashbulb memories, the knowledge about facts about 9/11, and knowledge of any personal loss or inconvenience experienced by the parent. And we looked at factors such as age, how much parents and children reported that they had talked about it, the parents' emotional response, the kids' emotional response, personal loss and inconvenience the parents had experienced, and also social collective identification as an American by the child. We didn't ask it to parents. And this was actually a written survey on MTurk, and nobody seemed to have problems, even though a few of the kids were 9, 10 years of age. And we then scored the consistency so we basically were interested in what the correspondence between what the parent reported about their flashbulb memory and what the child reported about their parents' flashbulb memory. And that was our correspondence score, and we used a coding scheme developed by Neischer and Hirst, which is a 2-point measure, saying absolutely wrong, 0, sort of partially correct, or just nailed it, which would be a 2. So many of the children did not know their parents' flashbulb memory. 11% reported, said, I just don't know. They said, I don't know. Of those who claimed they did, the consistency was 0.96, that out of 2. So not very good. And in fact, it was a bimodal distribution. 38% scored it just right. 11% scored somewhere in, and a total of 51% who said, I know, got completely wrong. And the kids were not terribly confident, 3.5 out of 5. But the parents were very confident in their flashbulb memory, which is common report of flashbulb memory, 7.5 out of 5. In terms of the parents' predictions, they all thought that their kid knew exactly what their flashbulb memory was. Only one of the parents reported that they didn't think their kid would know. On the other hand, they hedged their bets and weren't very confident the kid would know it accurately. What factors affected the correspondence between child's recollection of parental flashbulb memories and parental report? Age was a factor, but it wasn't super strong. Obviously, the older the kid got, the more likely they were to know something about their parents' flashbulb memory and know it accurately. How much the parent reported talking to the child did not at all affect whether or not the kid knew about it. So it's not how much you talked about it, it's whether somehow when you talked about it, it stuck in some way, shape, or form. Emotional response, again, it wasn't how emotionally evocative the parents thought it was that allowed that consistency. And nor did it how emotional it was affect the amount that you talked to, the parent talked to the child. And media attention also did not have any bearing, how much people actually attended to the media subsequent to 9/11. In terms of event memory, children knew about a third of the probes for facts. They knew about, and the facts were pretty simple facts. The facts we asked were really only 4. We asked them how many planes were involved, what cities were involved, where was George Bush at the time of the attack, and what were the name of the airlines involved in the attack. 2 of them are harder questions, that is where George Bush was and the names of the airlines. 2 of them are in almost every account of 9/11 you can think of, which is where the crash sites were and the number of planes. But kids got about a third of them right, meaning they don't know much, and parents don't know everything either, but they know a little bit better. Again, age mattered. Talk also mattered in terms of the facts, in terms of how much they talked about the facts, and in terms of how much they talked about their parents talked about their flashbulb memories. And the emotional response was, there was only one significant correlation that was, and I don't know what to make of it, between event memory accuracy and child report of parents' reaction to at the time of the attack. That is, if the child thought the parent was freaked out, then they tended to know more about it. And media attention, which I was very surprised, did not correlate. And I think it's probably because a lot of the media younger people tend to, even if it's about 9/11, maybe fictionalized accounts of somebody living in Brooklyn who experiences 9/11 or something of that sort, and doesn't actually talk about the facts at that level. Social identity seemed to matter. We had 2 assessments: identity as an American and the belief that 9/11 is important to identity as an American. Identity as an American turned out to be somewhat important. It correlated with age. That is, the older you were, the more you tended to identify with this collectivity, which is not surprising. And that suggested to us that we might not want to look at the most youngest folk, in that they really weren't asking them how do you identify as American was not to them a particularly meaningful question. In fact, Erik Erikson says that political identity doesn't come into about the age of 12. So we threw out everybody, any kid that was below the age of 12, and proceeded with our analysis. And what we find is that the more a child identifies as an American, the more negative the child's emotional response. The more the child identified as American, the more parents reported talking to the child about the facts of 9/11, presumably because the child may have solicited them. And the more the child identified, the greater the flashbulb memory correspondence. That is, the more they got accurately what the parents knew about how they learned about 9/11. There was not a correlation with event memory. So it didn't help in terms of how much they knew about the facts. It did make a difference in terms of whether they knew their parents' flashbulb memory. And I think these results underscore the importance of social identity. Not for so much for the transmission of facts about 9/11. They're out there, everybody's doing that for you in some way, shape, or form. But for the parents' personal memories about 9/11, how they learned about 9/11. And Dick Nysom claims that flashbulb memories are important because it allows one to say, I was there. Now, you weren't physically there. You weren't at ground zero. But that's what lived memories, lived collective memories, in some sense, allow you to do, is to say, I was part of this event that was important for the collectivity. And it allows you, in some sense, to be a witness to it. Even though you really are not a witness because you didn't witness it, you can nevertheless make those claims about witnessing. And I think that the parent then I think that when a child has this strong sense of being an American, they want to turn to their parents and have their parents witness, if you like, this event that is meaningful for them as an American. And so I think that it essentially is, it allows the child to solicit it because they think that by essentially having their parent being there, that makes their parent a credible witness to this event that is important to them because they are an American. Now, so far, what I've talked about is intergenerational limited to one generation. That is, I'm talking about the parent and the child. And as far as I know, there are not very many empirical studies of multiple generational, intergenerational transmission. Probably one of the best ones I know is, or the most interesting, is one by Harold Veltzer, which tells it all. The title of the monograph tells it all. Grandpa was not a Nazi. Basically, grandchildren believe that Grandpa was not a Nazi, even though Grandpa actually told them I was a Nazi. And they tend to falsely heroicize their parents' role in the war, even though the grandparent or had very clearly told them not the case. So it's a false memory, and but it's a personal memory that nevertheless has been transmitted. It just got somehow changed in the process of being transmitted across 2 generations. But I wanted to look at probably something a little less intense than that, and also look at intergenerational transmission. And here we looked at French-speaking Belgian families' memory of World War II. And we looked at 3 generations. Generation 0, which would be the generation that lived through the war, had to have been at least 8 at the time of the war, at some point during the war. We asked each generation separately to remember 4 different aspects of the war and the source of their knowledge. We asked them about rationing. Tell us something about rationing in the war. Bombing. Tell us something about bombing in the war. Collaboration and royal questions. So I should probably step back and say a little. Belgium very quickly conceded to the Germans, and the Germans invaded Belgium. And the King of Belgium did not leave Belgium, even though the extant government at that time went to England and ruled from there. And he was considered perhaps a collaborator with the Germans. And the royal question was, after the war, he fled to Switzerland. And the royal question was whether or not they should allow the king to come back, or the king should abdicate. We included it because my collaborator, Olivier Luminet, said his father was completely obsessed with the royal question, and when he was growing up, all he heard about was the royal question. Turns out only Olivier's father is obsessed with the royal question. But collaboration, it's probably somewhat important because we're looking at this in more detail now. We only looked at French-speaking Belgians. The stereotype is that the collaborators were all Flemish-speaking Belgians. and the French-speaking Belgians did not collaborate. But it turns out it was 50-50. You know, it didn't really matter if you were French-speaking or German-speaking if you turned out a collaborator. But to this day, that stereotype really is very strong. And we ask social identity questions and demographics. So, so the oldest generation talked more than anybody else, and these are individual recollections. The oldest generation's response is dominated again by personally relevant details. 58% of what they said, if they said, oh, there was rationing, that would just be a fact. But then they talked about personal details were like one woman told a story that she was standing in the rationing line and this German soldier approached her and she was like freaked out. She thought, oh my God, I'm going to be arrested or something. And he really just wanted to flirt with her. And she was so relieved. And that would be a personal memory. And the middle generation had a reasonable number of personal memories. By the youngest generation, it dropped off even more. The younger generation showed the greatest overlap of personal relevant memories with the older generation. I think that's probably because the middle generation probably knew more, and hence they didn't say everything they knew in a period of time. If you notice, the younger generation really talks very little. They knew nothing, basically. The middle generation is more likely to, if you ask them about the source, the middle generation is more likely to acquire the knowledge about 4 aspects of war through communication. They would say, I learned it by talking to people about it, presumably their parents in the main. And that's probably why they have more personal memories. The younger generation tended to say, well, I read about it in a book, or I saw it in a movie, or I learned about it in school. The lowest number of communicative memories basically the reason why it's so low for the oldest generation in terms of communicative memories is they didn't learn about it from somebody else. They lived through it. And they reported these are memories I lived through as opposed to learned about it from somebody else, which is why they're classified as personal memories. So it appears that historically relevant personal memories are transmitted in one generation, but not as many. The transmission to the next generation is not very good. And it's unclear why this is so. It may be that Belgium is a special case. For instance, there is no, in high school and junior high, there is no Belgian history course. You know, like we take an American history course or a French history course. There's no Belgian history course. And the reason why is because it's a bilingual society. It's very, very divided. And they cannot come to terms about how to tell history. I call it the sofa problem. If you and your significant other can't decide on what kind of sofa to buy, you live with the lousy sofa that you have for decades. And they've lived for decades with no history course whatsoever. Another possibility is it requires interest on both sides, and it may be the younger generation. By the time you get 2 generations, you're no longer interested in what those old people experienced. And clearly family interactions may play a role. That there were some families which knew a lot, and if the person that interviewed the families said that these were families that when another part of the study, we had them talk to each other about the war, and she said they just talked a lot. The discussion was more free-flowing and the like. So I suspect family dynamics come into play somewhat. But that's really hard to study, so I avoided it. The last thing is, okay, so it doesn't get transmitted a lot. There are a lot of personal memories that sort of fade by the second generation. But then there's the question of, are communicative memories and cultural memories really all that different? So far, the studies have examined basically events that are a mix of communicative and cultural. World War II is very much a cultural memory now, as much as a communicative memory, and slowly we're losing the communicative aspect of it. Even something right about 9/11, you now have 9/11 museums and memorials. There's books, there's movies. There's lots. There are lots of cultural artifacts going on, but it's not always the case that that you have instances in which you might have a communicative memory, but it doesn't necessarily get translated into cultural memory. And although there are very few people that actually have communicative memories of this at the present moment. A good example, for instance, is in Turkey, the Armenian genocide. It has not been institutionalized at all. In fact, it's illegal to talk about it. You can get thrown in jail. So in order to sort of address this issue, Felipe suggested that we contrast the economic crisis of 2001 with the Argentinian coup d'etat. Now, the reason why he suggested that, now, I know that these are not, from an experimental psychologist's viewpoint, this gives me the willies, because these are not exactly the same event. Everything is not controlled. There are different time periods. Number of deaths differ drastically. Nevertheless, it does serve as an interesting contrast. The 2001 economic crises were the worst political, economic, and social crisis in Argentinian democratic history. Between December 19th and December 21st, the 30 demonstrators were killed by secular forces. The state of siege was declared at the end of December. There were 5 new governments founded in 1 week. That beats Italy any day. The unemployment was 23%. The poverty rate was 55%. The GDP dropped 20%. All bank accounts were frozen. It was not a good time. What makes it interesting is that, by and large, it hasn't been placed into cultural artifacts. So whereas the junta, doing various internet searches, it appears that about 150 movies have been made about the coup. There are more than 150 books. It's incorporated in the textbooks in Argentina. There is a commemoration day, March 24th, and there are many memorials, including a main memorial in Buenos Aires. With respect to the economic crisis, we could find maybe 15, maybe that's stretching it. There were about 30 books where not figured prominently. It's not mentioned in any of the Argentinian textbooks. There's no official commemoration, and there's very few memorials. So one seems less like a cultural memory than the other. They're both still very much can be communicative memories, but one is heavily on the communicative side, and the other one is clearly making it to the cultural side. So I'm going to treat the 1976 coup as cultural and the 2001 coup as, economic crisis as communicative. And we looked again at younger and older participants so that their memories were either lived or distant for both events, and we asked them to recall what they knew about the economic crisis. We used the old data from the other study as a contrast. And what we find is that in terms of personal memories, the difference between lived and distant is quite marked. That is, if you lived through it, if it's cultural and distant, you have many non-personal memories, and you have very few personal memories. If it's lived, you have a much better balance between cultural and personal. On the other hand, you see no difference whatsoever in communicative memories. Even though you didn't live through it, you nevertheless tell the story in personal terms, because the way you know about it is from your parents who told you about it in personal terms, and there has been no cultural artifacts to come in and substitute and provide an alternative rendering. So basically, when it is solely communicative, essentially what's transmitted from one generation to another is a very similar memory. But when it begins to become part of the cultural discourse, then the memory begins to take on a non-personal character. And because it takes on that non-personal character, the memories that you report have less of a personal character to them. In terms of causes and negative affect evaluation, again, if you look at lived and distant, in terms of cultural, you see in terms of causes a fairly drastic, you see basically the opposite pattern. Here, causes were very high among lived and not, but not in terms of you had a very large drop between lived and distant in terms of causes. For lived, there was a drop, but it wasn't quite as dramatic. So there was an interaction, if you like. For negative emotions, again, what happens when they become culturalized, they all become sort of, if you like, and this might also, there's a confound here because there's a temporal distance. They become more negated, they become suppressed. They're not as strong and profound. Here, they remain very, very negative. It could be probably a time thing. This was 2001, this was 1976, the reason why they get suppressed. On the other hand, 30,000 people were killed here, only 30 were killed here. So I don't know how far to push that. But one possible rendering is they remain high and negative because what you hear is your parents telling you about the horrible things that happen rather than read it in sort of a neutral textbook, if you like. So especially in terms of personal narratives, communicative memories are similar, whether lived or distant, or somewhat similar. But for cultural memories, differences emerge between lived and different memories, especially in terms of causes and in terms of amount of personal renderings. Now, I have some additional studies in progress. And so, I mean, this has a sort of like catch-as-catch-can sort of character to it. It's not as systematic. You have a theory, and then you sort of test the theory and control all of the various options and the like. I'm taking advantage of particular instances of chances to look at how intergenerational memories are transmitted. So in Belgium, we're undertaking a study now looking at both French and Flemish speakers of families where the family, either the grandparent, either collaborated or did not collaborate. It turns out the major impediment in this study right now is it is extremely hard to get children to talk about their parents' collaboration or grandparents' collaboration if they are a French-speaking family. It is not hard to do so if they're a Flemish-speaking family. And I could explain why I think that's true. I'm also interested in, which has nothing to do with nations, but interested in generational differences memory for gay history, in that since so much of this transmission is between parent and child, what happens when your parent is not part of that collectivity that is involved in that transmission? And so I'm interested in how intergenerational transmission occurs outside the family setting, if you like. And Felipe has convinced me that we should also look at the Falkland War, and we are looking at how both Argentinians and Brits remember the Falkland War intergenerationally. So where does this leave us? Lived memories tend to be told in more personal manner than distant memories. Indeed, although one is discussing a historical event if one lived through it, one tends to recount it with personal anecdotes. Lived memories tend to be more contextualized, have more causal connectors, even though it is distant memories that have become incorporated into cultural artifacts and presumably expressed in coherent narratives. People with distant memories are more defensive about the problematic aspects of the past than people with lived memories. Transmission of communicative memories appear to be limited to one generation, at least many instances. Successful transmission does not depend on the emotional intensity or the talk between one generation or the next, at least in some instances. It does seem somewhat age dependent. Parents may think that they transmit something when they really haven't. Transmission of personal memories may depend on the extent to which the child identifies with the affected community. And I talked about that already. And lived and distant communicative memories tend to be similar, at least in comparison to lived and distant cultural memories. When a memory becomes cultural, it takes on characteristics that is distinct from those associated with lived memories. The personal is lost as well, to agree, the contextual and the affective evaluative. So I'm only really beginning to nail down some of the dynamics of intergenerational transmission. I'm not sure that what I have to say is as accurate as I would like it to be, because I have a very few number of studies. There's the number in the literature is very limited. So what I'm really saying is that I'm suggesting these are tentative conclusions. But it does appear to me that the distinction between communicative and cultural and lived and distance proves to be quite useful. But I want to end by saying it's important to continue, since, as I noted from the beginning, what one generation knows about historical events of a previous generation is important to their collective identity and their collective action. And I want to thank these people. And any questions?